Julian thought throwing divorce papers at my face in the company lobby was the ultimate display of power. He gave me 24 hours to vacate our penthouse so his mistress could replace me. But he forgot I control the sound for the charity gala he is desperate to impress tonight. Instead of a symphony, the elite will hear his darkest secrets, turning his glory into a public trial. My name is Elena Vance. At 32 years old, I have learned that the most dangerous sound in the world is not an explosion, but the silence before a system failure. As the technical director of events for the massive media conglomerate Nebula Horizon, I was standing behind the master audio console in the grand atrium, running frequency checks for the upcoming charity ball. The hall was empty, a cavern of marble and glass waiting to be filled with the city's elite, until the double doors swung open and shattered my concentration. Julian walked in with the entitlement of a man who believes he owns the ground beneath his feet. Clinging to his arm was Sierra, a social media influencer whose face I recognized from the thousands of selfies she posted online. Julian did not hesitate. He marched straight up to my elevated control booth and slammed a thick manila envelope down onto my mixing board, right over the delicate faders I had spent an hour calibrating. The impact caused a sharp feedback screech to rip through the overhead speakers, but Julian did not flinch. He announced loud enough for my entire crew to hear that these were divorce papers. He demanded I sign them immediately and vacate our penthouse within 24 hours so Sierra could move in. My lighting technicians and stagehands froze on the catwalks above. Julian was performing for them, using my humiliation as a romantic gesture for his mistress. He looked at me with a sneer, criticizing my appearance. He told everyone present that he was tired of coming home to someone so boring and rigid. He claimed he needed a woman who matched his rising status, someone with vitality. Sierra laughed, a high-pitched sound that grated against my ear for perfect pitch. She looked me up and down, mocking my black tactical cargo pants and technical headset. She told me that the era of invisible old hags was over and that she was doing me a favor by taking him off my hands. I did not cry. I did not scream. I felt the adrenaline spike in my blood, but I forced my heart rate to slow down, a technique I used when managing live broadcasts for millions of viewers. I looked at the man I had been married to for 8 years. I did not see a husband. I saw a pathogen, a microscopic germ under a lens that needed to be eradicated for the host body to survive. I simply picked up the envelope and checked the signature line. Julian leaned over the console, invading my personal space. He lowered his voice and told me with malicious glee that he had already drained our joint bank accounts that morning. He had transferred every cent into an investment for Sierra's new virtual fashion project. He wanted me to know that I had no resources to fight him in court. He thought this financial paralysis would break me. I pulled a pen from my utility belt and signed the document without reading a single clause. I handed the papers back to him and looked him dead in the eye. I told him that was fine, but reminded him that the Silver Gala was tomorrow night, and he still needed me to run the sound for his keynote speech. Julian laughed, tucking the papers into his jacket as if they were a trophy. He told me that after tomorrow night, he would be a platinum partner of the firm, while I would remain nothing but hired help. He promised to fire me the moment the event concluded. He took Sierra's hand and they turned to leave, confident in their absolute victory. I watched them walk away, their footsteps echoing on the polished floor. My hand slipped into the deep pocket of my work vest, my fingers closing around the cold metal of an encrypted USB drive. Julian thought he had just ended our marriage, but he had actually just authorized the beginning of his destruction. I turned back to my screens and silently typed in the command to activate the dark protocol. The silence in the empty atrium felt heavy, but my mind was already racing backward, dissecting the timeline of a disaster I should have predicted 8 years ago. Julian was nothing more than a junior sales associate with an ill-fitting suit and a tremble in his voice whenever he had to speak to a client. I was the one who saw potential where others saw mediocrity. I used my connections in the industry to open doors that were locked to him. I coached him on how to hold a room, how to shake hands with firmness, and how to negotiate without looking desperate. I built the ladder he climbed, rung by rung, until he sat in the CEO chair of our subsidiary. For nearly a decade, I was the architect of his public persona. Every inspiring speech he delivered at shareholder meetings was written by me on our kitchen island at 2 a.m. Every strategic pivot that earned him accolades in business magazines was born from my analysis, whispered into his ear over coffee before he left for the office. He stood in the spotlight, basking in the adoration of the board and the public, while I stood in the shadows, ensuring the foundation beneath him did not crumble. I was content to be his partner in silence, believing that his success was our success. The anomalies in his behavior began 6 months ago. It started with a cloying scent of vanilla and cheap musk clinging to his shirts, a smell that defied the expensive detergent I used. Then came the urgent business trips to Miami and Las Vegas, always scheduled on weekends, always critical. I did not confront him with tears or accusations. Emotional outbursts are inefficient and yield poor data. Instead, I updated the security protocols on our shared devices. Under the guise of installing a new family safety package, I embedded military-grade monitoring software onto his smartphone and the operating system of his luxury sedan. The data I harvested was illuminating. Sierra was not the daughter of a shipping tycoon as she claimed on her social media profiles. My background search revealed she was a professional grifter with a credit score in the double digits and a trail of lawsuits across 3 states. She was drowning in debt, and she had identified Julian as her lifeline. But what turned my heartbreak into cold, clinical rage was not the infidelity. It was the professional betrayal. Julian was so blinded by her flattery that he had begun selling Nebula Horizon trade secrets to our competitors to fund her lavish requests. The final piece of evidence came 2 days ago. I intercepted a conversation where they discussed the Silver Gala. They were not just planning to attend, they were conspiring to embezzle the charity funds meant for underprivileged children to pay off Sierra's gambling debts. I sat there, headphones on, listening to the man I vowed to love and cherish describe me to his mistress. He laughed and called me his guard dog, a boring, useful creature who kept his life organized while he had fun. He said I was too stupid to notice the money missing from our accounts. That specific insult flipped a switch inside me. The pain evaporated, replaced by a profound sense of disgust. It was the same feeling I experienced when locating a malicious virus in a server network. You do not mourn the virus, you isolate it and you purge it. I decided then that I would not just sign the divorce papers, I would defend my honor and the intellectual property of the company I helped build. I spent the entire night in the server room, surrounded by the hum of cooling fans. I pulled the raw audio files from his car and phone, loading them into my editing software. I sliced the waveforms, removed the background noise, and equalized the levels. I was not just editing audio, I was composing a symphony of truth. By the time the sun rose, the files were ready. The stage was set for his destruction, and I had the best seat in the house. I arrived at the Nebula Horizon headquarters at 4 a.m, long before the first catering trucks were scheduled to dock. The building was a steel and glass monolith sleeping under the pre-dawn sky. But inside, the network never slept. I bypassed the standard security checkpoint using a maintenance keycard and headed straight for the main control hub. My fingers flew across the mechanical keyboard as I entered my Supreme Administrator credentials. The system welcomed me with a green blinking cursor, granting me total access to the building's security and audiovisual infrastructure. My first stop was the guest list database for the Silver Gala. I noticed the file had been modified at 2 a.m. Julian had been busy. I cross-referenced the changes and felt a cold smirk touch my lips. He had deleted the names of 3 of our oldest and most conservative investors, people who prioritized ethics over profits. In their place, he had manually added a dozen strangers. A quick background check revealed them to be Sierra's entourage, a group of party promoters and influencers who had no business at a corporate charity event. Julian was turning a prestigious gala into a playground for his mistress. I opened an encrypted chat channel to Marcus, a private investigator I had known since my college days. He had been working on my request for 48 hours straight. The transfer bar on my screen filled up, delivering a heavy folder of PDF files. Marcus had found everything. Sierra was not a wealthy heiress. Her real name was Brenda, and she had a criminal record spanning 3 different states for check fraud and identity theft. I took these documents and began the complex process of integrating them into the visual matrix of the stage. I programmed the massive LED wall that spanned the entire back of the stage to function as a secondary display. I set the system to trigger specific images based on voice keywords. If Julian said the word honesty, the screen would flash a mugshot of Sierra. It was a landmine field made of pixels. My phone buzzed on the console. It was Julian. I let it ring twice before answering, pitching my voice to sound weak and congested. He demanded to know where I was, warning me not to ruin his big night with my gloomy presence. I lied smoothly, telling him I had come down with a severe flu and could barely stand. I promised him I had sent a competent junior assistant to handle the soundboard in the main hall. He did not even feign concern for my health. He simply told me to stay away and hung up. He thought he had won a night of freedom. He had no idea I was currently sitting 3 floors above the ballroom in the secret server room on the penthouse level, a dusty, windowless space that did not appear on the building blueprints. From this vantage point, I had a digital god's eye view of the venue. I accessed the schematic for the table arrangements. Julian had placed himself and Sierra at VIP Table 1, right in the center of the room. Earlier, during the initial setup, I had replaced the standard decorative centerpieces with ones containing high-fidelity omnidirectional microphones. I adjusted the gain on my mixer, listening to the ambient noise of the empty room. The audio was crystal clear. I could hear the hum of the air conditioning vents. I launched my custom AI voice recognition software. I uploaded samples of Julian and Sierra's voices from my phone recordings. The software spent a few minutes building a spectral fingerprint for each of them. I configured the system to automatically sync their live words with the archive of incriminating recordings I had edited the night before. The program was ready to intercept their speech and overlay the pre-recorded evidence in real time, effectively making them confess their crimes through their own voices. The door to the server room beeped, startling me. I minimized the windows instantly, my hand reaching for the pepper spray in my pocket. But it was Sarah, a senior audio engineer and one of the few people I trusted. She stood in the doorway, holding 2 cups of black coffee. She looked at the monitors, where the surveillance feed of the ballroom was clearly visible, and then at the code running on my screen. She realized immediately that I was not sick. She walked over, placed a coffee next to my keyboard, and pulled up a chair. She told me that Julian had made a pass at her intern last week, and that she had been waiting for someone to take him down. She offered to monitor the firewall to ensure no one from the IT department could interrupt my override. With Sarah guarding the digital perimeter, I executed the final step of my preparation. I composed an email to the board of directors. I used a VPN to mask my IP address, ensuring the message could not be traced back to me. The subject line read, "Urgent advisory regarding the keynote speech." The body of the text was brief. I suggested that for the sake of the company's future, they should pay very close attention to what Julian Vance had to say tonight. I hit send and watched the confirmation message appear. The trap was set, the players were taking their positions, and I was ready to conduct the performance of a lifetime. The Silver Gala commenced with a suffocating display of opulence. The grand atrium had been transformed into a gold-plated cage for New York's upper crust. Crystal chandeliers the size of small cars hung from the ceiling, casting a fractured light over the sea of silk gowns and tuxedos. Waiters moved like ghosts through the crowd, carrying trays of champagne that cost more per bottle than most people earned in a month. It was a spectacle of excess, a perfect facade to hide the rot festering at its core. Julian made his entrance like a conquering king. He wore a midnight blue bespoke suit that I knew cost $5,000 because I had seen the invoice he tried to hide in the household expenses. On his arm, Sierra glittered like a disco ball. She was draped in a diamond necklace and matching earrings that caught every flash of the paparazzi cameras. To the untrained eye, she looked like royalty, but I knew the truth. Those diamonds were not hers, nor were they a gift from Julian's personal funds. They were rented from a high-end jeweler, and the deposit had been paid using the Nebula Horizon corporate expense account under the code for stage equipment rentals. Sierra attempted to navigate the room with an air of sophisticated boredom, but her mask slipped the moment she opened her mouth. I watched on my monitor as she tried to insert herself into a conversation between two oil tycoons discussing macroeconomic trends in the Asian markets. She smiled vacantly and made a comment about how inflation was ruining the price of imported handbags. The tycoons exchanged a look of polite confusion before turning their backs to her. It was a painful display of inadequacy, but Julian was too busy preening to notice. He paraded her around the room, introducing her to our oldest partners as the new creative director of the charity fund. It was a title that did not exist until this morning. I saw the skeptical brow of Mr. Henderson, a board member who had known me for a decade, twitch as he shook Sierra's hand. He looked around, likely wondering where I was, but Julian quickly steered the conversation away, guiding Sierra toward the VIP section. I observed all of this from the darkness of the hidden server room. My face was illuminated only by the cool blue glow of the high-resolution surveillance monitors. I felt like a director watching actors on a stage, waiting for the cue to drop the curtain on their heads. I zoomed the camera in on VIP Table 1. Julian leaned in close to a group of his college friends, men who had always tolerated me rather than liked me. He laughed loudly, a sound that the hidden microphones picked up with terrifying clarity. He bragged that he had finally kicked his old, boring wife to the curb and that by tomorrow morning, he would have total control over the subsidiary. He called it a necessary upgrade for a man of his stature. Sierra leaned into him, her lips brushing his ear. To the room, it looked like an intimate moment between lovers. To my audio system, it was a confession. She whispered excitedly about their flight to the Maldives the next day, giggling about how they would spend the embezzled funds on a private villa. She asked if the transfer from the charity account had cleared yet, and Julian assured her it was done. The microphones concealed within the white hydrangeas on their table captured every syllable of their greed. The raw audio was messy, filled with the clinking of silverware and the hum of the crowd. My hands moved steadily over the virtual mixing board. I applied noise reduction filters, cut the low-end rumble, and boosted the high frequencies of their voices. Within seconds, their whispers were isolated, processed, and cued. On my system, their voices sounded as crisp and clear as if they were standing in a recording booth. Down on the floor, the lights dimmed. The chatter subsided as the chairman of Nebula Horizon walked up to the podium. He began his speech about integrity and vision. Julian straightened his tie, a smug smile plastering itself onto his face. He stood up, buttoning his jacket, ready to ascend the stage to accept the Leader of the Year award. He had spent $50,000 lobbying for this trophy, believing it would cement his legitimacy. He had no idea that the only thing waiting for him on that stage was the truth. Julian stepped up to the podium, basking in the applause that rippled through the gilded hall. He adjusted his silk tie, grabbed the microphone with a practiced grip, and opened his mouth to deliver the speech I had written for him 3 years ago. The moment he tried to speak, a sharp, high-pitched squeal of feedback tore through the speakers, causing everyone in the front row to cover their ears. Julian flinched, pulling back as if the microphone had burned him. The noise cut out instantly, returning the room to a heavy silence. He glared at the sound booth at the back of the room, his jaw tight with irritation. But he quickly recovered, flashing a charming smile to mask his annoyance. He cleared his throat and launched into his monologue about the pillars of corporate responsibility and ethical leadership. As he spoke about the importance of transparency in business, I tapped a single key on my command console. Behind him, on the massive LED backdrop that was supposed to display the Nebula Horizon logo, a high-definition image flashed for a fraction of a second. It was a picture of an old, mangy fox with a sly grin. It appeared and vanished so quickly that it felt like a subliminal message. A wave of giggles moved through the audience. Julian, unable to see the screen behind his back, misinterpreted the reaction completely. He thought they were charmed by his eloquence. He puffed out his chest, his confidence swelling, and continued with even more theatrical enthusiasm. Down at the VIP table, Sierra was already bored with his performance. She pulled her phone out from her clutch, shielding it under the white tablecloth. Through my hacked interface, I watched her type a message to a contact saved as Brad X. She typed that she was almost done with this idiot and that once she secured the ring and the cash, she would leave him dry. She bragged that he was incredibly easy to manipulate. I decided it was time to share her private thoughts with a select audience. I routed the display of her phone to the secondary monitors located in the wings of the hall, screens that were usually reserved for displaying donor names. The text message popped up in large, bright font. It was only visible to the tables on the far left, but that was enough. Mrs. Sterling, the matriarch of New York real estate and a major investor, squinted at the screen. Her eyes widened in shock. She nudged her husband and pointed discreetly at the monitor. A low murmur of confusion and judgment began to spread from that corner of the room like a slow leak in a dam. On stage, Julian was reaching the emotional climax of his speech. He raised a hand dramatically and spoke about the importance of unyielding loyalty to one's partners. The moment the word loyalty left his lips, I triggered a specific sound file. A cold, mocking laugh blasted through the main audio array. It was Julian's own laugh, recorded from a conversation where he had mocked my intelligence. It cut right through his sentence, sharp and cruel. Julian froze mid-gesture. He looked around wildly, scanning the dark room. The laughter stopped as abruptly as it had begun. The silence that followed was thick with tension. He blinked, looking at the sound booth again, but saw only the reflection of the stage lights on the dark glass. He shook his head, convincing himself it was an echo or a hallucination brought on by stress. Up in the server room, I leaned back in my chair, my fingers hovering over the controls. I was playing a game of cat and mouse, nudging them toward the edge of the cliff before the final shove. I watched Sierra shift uncomfortably in her seat. She sensed the change in the atmosphere. She looked at the side screens and saw them go black just as she turned her head. She felt the eyes of Mrs. Sterling burning into her. She made a frantic slashing motion across her throat, signaling Julian to wrap it up and get off the stage. But Julian was too far gone. He was drunk on the attention, believing the murmurs were praise and the tension was anticipation. He ignored her signal completely and launched into an unscripted anecdote about his personal genius, completely unaware that the ground beneath him was about to open up. The moment Julian composed himself and leaned into the microphone, the room fell into a respectful hush. He looked out at the audience with practiced sincerity and began to say that his wife had always supported him. That was the trigger I had been waiting for. I did not hesitate. I slammed my finger onto the cut button for his live feed and simultaneously pushed the fader for the playback channel to the maximum level. Julian continued mouthing words, but no sound came out. Instead, his voice from the recording I had captured in his car boomed through the state-of-the-art Dolby surround sound system. It was loud, raw, and completely stripping him of his dignity. The recording played him saying that bitch Elena was so stupid and that he was going to strip her of every dime she had. The silence that followed the clip was absolute. It was the vacuum before an explosion. Julian froze. He looked down at the microphone and then up at the ceiling speakers, his eyes wide with confusion. He slammed his hand against the podium and screamed for the technical team to cut the audio. He demanded to know what was going on. But without the microphone, his voice was thin and weak, barely reaching the first row of tables. He looked toward the control booth at the back of the room, gesturing wildly. I saw the junior technicians down there frantically pushing buttons and pulling cables. But it was useless. I had locked the entire audio-visual system with a complex encryption key that only I possessed. They were locked out of their own board. I was the only pilot flying this plane. I did not give the audience time to process the shock. I cued the next file immediately. This time, Sierra's voice pierced the air, shrill and unmistakably greedy. The speakers broadcast her demand that he needed to get the charity money transferred fast because she needed to buy a new Hermes bag before the wait list opened. The reaction was instantaneous. Mrs. Sterling, the most prominent donor in the room, stood up so abruptly that her chair toppled over backward. Her face was flushed with a deep, angry red. Around her, other sponsors and board members rose to their feet, a wave of indignation sweeping through the hall. They had donated millions of dollars to help underprivileged children, not to fund the luxury accessory collection of a mistress. Sierra realized the tide had turned against her. She grabbed her clutch and scrambled away from the table, attempting to run toward the side exit. I was ready for her. I engaged the automated lighting rig and directed a 10,000 lumen spotlight to snap directly onto her. The beam pinned her against the velvet wall like an insect under a magnifying glass. She shielded her eyes, blinded by the intensity, unable to move or hide. I shifted my focus to the visual feeds. I cleared the Fox image from the massive LED wall behind Julian and replaced it with high-resolution scans of their bank statements. I had highlighted the transaction rows in neon red. The screen displayed the wire transfers moving directly from the Charity Foundation account into a shell company registered in Sierra's name. The evidence was 30 feet tall and impossible to ignore. Julian stood on the stage, sweating under the lights. He began waving his arms, shouting to anyone who would listen that this was a lie. He yelled that it was an AI deepfake created by his enemies to ruin him. He tried to claim it was a conspiracy, but his voice cracked, and he looked small and desperate against the backdrop of his own financial crimes. I decided that the people in this room were not a large enough audience for this level of justice. I executed the command to go live. The camera feeds from the ballroom were instantly broadcast to the official Nebula Horizon social media accounts. Notifications pinged on 12 million phones across the world. The viewer count skyrocketed from 0 to 50,000 in seconds, and the comments section became a blur of shock and outrage. The event security team finally snapped out of their stupor and started moving toward the stage and the control booth to regain order. I could not let them interrupt the finale. I activated the building's emergency lockdown protocol. The heavy magnetic locks on the main double doors engaged with a loud, mechanical thud. The exits were sealed. The ballroom had been transformed into a closed arena with no way in and no way out. Julian and Sierra were trapped in the spotlight, and the world was watching. Julian's expression shifted from indignation to pure, unadulterated horror as the audio fidelity changed. He recognized the specific, muted acoustics of the recording playing through the speakers. It was the sound of his own voice bouncing off the hand-stitched leather interior of his luxury sedan, the one place on Earth he believed was completely soundproof and private. He had treated that car like a confessional booth, but he had forgotten that I was the one who managed the family security upgrades. I decided to escalate the stakes from a simple marital dispute to a federal indictment. I queued up the file labeled Permit Accusation. His voice boomed out, bragging about how he had slipped $50,000 in cash to a city building inspector to bypass safety regulations on his latest construction project. He laughed on the tape, calling the inspector a cheap date. The gasps from the audience were audible even through the glass of the control room. This was no longer just juicy gossip. This was a confession to a felony that carried a minimum sentence of 5 years in prison. Then, it was Sierra's turn. Or rather, Brenda's. I executed the command to replace the bank statements on the giant LED wall with the dossier Marcus had compiled. The name Sierra vanished, replaced by her legal birth name, Brenda, in bold, unforgiving letters. Underneath her real name listed her 2 prior convictions for romance fraud and grand larceny in Ohio and Florida. To maximize the comedic effect, I displayed her police mugshot side by side with the live feed of her standing on the floor. The contrast was brutal. On the left was Brenda in an orange jumpsuit, with no makeup, messy hair, and a scowl that suggested she would bite anyone who came too close. On the right was the woman currently wearing rented diamonds and trembling in a silk gown. The illusion of the sophisticated socialite evaporated instantly. She was not a victim. She was a predator who had simply moved on to a bigger carcass. The atmosphere in the ballroom shifted from shock to hostility. These people did not like being played. Someone from the back tables threw a linen napkin onto the stage. Then a bread roll followed. Soon, expensive floral arrangements were being hurled toward the podium. The crowd began to boo, a low, ugly sound that vibrated against the walls. Julian spun around to look at his mistress. For the first time, the fog of lust cleared from his eyes. He looked at the mugshot looming over them, then down at the woman he had destroyed his marriage for. He realized with sickening clarity that he had burned down his entire life for a professional criminal who was currently wanted in another state. He looked like a man who had just realized the parachute he packed was actually a backpack full of rocks. Sierra, realizing the game was completely up, abandoned her act. She turned on Julian, her face twisting into the same ugly snarl from her mugshot. She screamed at him, calling him a spineless idiot and cursing him for getting them caught. She had forgotten, in her rage, that the microphones hidden in the hydrangeas at their table were still live. Her insults were broadcast in high-definition surround sound. The ballroom turned into a theater for a dark, improvised comedy. Guests pulled out their phones, recording the meltdown of the year. I watched them tear each other apart for another 30 seconds, letting the humiliation soak into their bones. Then, I decided it was time for the director to step onto the stage. I pressed the master talkback button on my console, overriding all other audio inputs. The feedback squealed for a microsecond before my voice filled the room, calm, authoritative, and echoing like a judgment from the heavens. "Good evening, Julian." The sound of my voice hit him like a physical blow. He stopped arguing mid-sentence. Slowly, terrified, he lifted his head and looked up toward the darkened glass of the control booth on the upper level. Even from this distance, I could see the blood drain completely from his face, leaving him as pale as the divorce papers he had thrown at me only yesterday. I stepped out of the shadows of the control booth and walked onto the mezzanine balcony that overlooked the glittering chaos of the ballroom. I stood there for a moment, letting the spotlight find me, clutching my tablet like a gavel in a high court. The crowd below fell silent, their faces turned upward, waiting for the final verdict. I tapped the screen of my device, and my voice echoed through the hall, amplified and crystal clear, stripping away the last remnants of the party's festive atmosphere. I looked directly at Julian, who was trembling on the stage, and told the audience that this man had not only betrayed the sanctity of our marriage, but had also betrayed the trust of every single person in the room. With a swipe of my finger, I changed the display on the massive LED screen once more. The mugshots and text messages vanished, replaced by a complex web of spreadsheets and financial graphs. I explained that for the last 2 years, Julian had been systematically falsifying the quarterly financial reports of Nebula Horizon. He had been inflating profits to secure his bonuses while hiding the massive debts he was incurring to fund his lifestyle. The reaction was immediate. The chairman of the board, a man known for his ruthless adherence to corporate governance, stood up from his table near the front. His face was purple with rage. He pointed a shaking finger at the stage and ordered the security team to detain Julian immediately for an internal investigation. 2 large guards in dark suits began to march toward the podium, moving through the stunned crowd like sharks through water. Julian watched them approach, and his composure shattered completely. The arrogant executive who had thrown divorce papers at me the day before vanished. In his place was a desperate, broken man. He dropped to his knees right there on the stage, heedless of the cameras flashing around him. He looked up at me on the balcony, tears streaming down his face, and begged me to stop. He pointed a shaking hand at Sierra and screamed that she had bewitched him, that he was not in his right mind, and that she was the one who forced him to steal the money. Sierra, realizing she was being thrown under the bus, did not go down quietly. She lunged at him, her face twisted in fury. She shouted into the ambient microphones that he was a liar and the mastermind behind the entire embezzlement scheme. She confessed that she only followed his instructions because he promised her a life of luxury. It was a pathetic display of mutual destruction, two rats fighting on a sinking ship. I waited for them to finish screaming before I delivered the next blow. I leaned over the railing and asked Julian if he remembered his demand for me to vacate our penthouse within 24 hours. I saw the confusion in his tear-filled eyes. I told him that he seemed to have forgotten a crucial detail about our asset structure. I asked him if he ever actually checked the property deed. I revealed that the penthouse was never marital property, nor was it in his name. I had purchased it through my private holding company 3 years before we even met. The only guest in that house was him, and his residency had just been permanently revoked. Julian slumped back on his heels, his mouth agape. He had spent years believing he was the king of his castle, never realizing he was just a tenant living on my grace. But I was not done. I had one final secret to share, the one that would seal his fate far beyond the loss of his job or his home. I asked him about the USB drive he had used the previous day to copy the confidential client database, the one he intended to sell to our competitors to fund his escape. I saw the color drain from his face as he realized I knew about his corporate espionage. I told him that the drive did not just copy files. It contained a Trojan horse virus that I had written specifically for him. I explained that the moment he plugged that drive into his laptop, the virus bypassed his encryption and automatically packaged every incriminating document, every email, and every illegal wire transfer record he had ever made. I smiled, a cold, hard expression that offered no mercy. I informed him that the virus had not just stored the data, it had automatically emailed the entire evidence package to the Cybercrime Division of the Federal Bureau of Investigation exactly 10 minutes ago. I told him he might want to save his tears because he was going to need them for the federal agents who were undoubtedly on their way to pick him up. The wail of sirens pierced the heavy silence of the ballroom, effectively ending the stunned quiet that had followed my revelation. The sound grew louder with terrifying speed, vibrating against the glass walls of the atrium until the main doors were forced open by a tactical unit from the Economic Crimes Division. They moved with precise, practiced efficiency, swarming the room and heading straight for the stage where Julian and Sierra were still turning on each other. The flashing blue and red lights from the police cruisers outside washed over the gold-leafed ceiling, turning the luxurious gala into a crime scene. Julian and Sierra were apprehended right there on the red carpet, in full view of the hundreds of guests and the dozens of press cameras that were now live-streaming the arrest to the world. I watched as the agents pulled Julian's hands behind his back. The metallic click of the handcuffs locking around his wrists was a sound sweeter than any applause I had ever heard. He thrashed against the hold of the officers, his face contorted with a mix of fear and rage. He looked up at the balcony where I stood and screamed my name. He yelled that I was a heartless monster, that I had planned this just to ruin him, and that I was the one who should be in chains. His accusations fell on deaf ears. The crowd looked at him with nothing but cold contempt, the way one looks at a disease that has finally been cured. Sierra tried a different tactic. As the female officer grabbed her arm, she dissolved into hysterics. She sobbed loudly, claiming she was just an innocent girl who had been manipulated by a powerful man. She begged the cameras for sympathy, trying to play the role of the naive victim, but her performance was destroyed by her own words. The video loop I had played earlier, where she mocked the poor and bragged about her greed, was still fresh in everyone's mind. A reporter near the stage shouted a question about her fake identity, and her tears instantly dried up, replaced by a look of pure venom. I watched my husband being dragged away like a common criminal, and I felt absolutely nothing. There were no tears, no pang of regret, and no lingering affection. It was like watching a demolition crew bring down a condemned building. It was simply a necessary removal of something dangerous. I remained perfectly still, my hands resting on the railing, observing the collapse of his life with clinical detachment. Mrs. Sterling, the formidable investor who had been the first to turn on them, walked up the stairs to the mezzanine. She stood beside me, looking down at the chaos below. She extended her hand to me, her grip firm and respectful. She told me that the company needed leadership with integrity and eyes that saw everything. She offered me the lead on the upcoming international project, the very position Julian had spent 5 years trying to secure. I accepted her handshake, acknowledging the shift in power. The news of the arrest had already hit the financial markets. My phone buzzed with alerts indicating that the stock prices of the shell companies Julian was associated with were free-falling. He was not just going to prison, he was going to be bankrupt before he even reached the holding cell. Just as the officers were shoving Julian toward the exit, a man in a sharp gray suit stepped out of the crowd and intercepted them. It was my attorney. He held up a hand to pause the procession and thrust a document into Julian's cuffed hands. It was the divorce decree, fully signed and notarized, along with a restraining order effective immediately. Julian stared at the papers, realizing that even in his downfall, I had managed to sever the last tie binding us together. I turned to the event organizers who were standing nearby, looking pale and terrified. I informed them that I would be waiving my consulting fee for the night. Instead, I instructed them to donate the entire sum, which was $15,000, to a foundation that supported women recovering from financial abuse. Sarah, my colleague who had guarded the door, came running up the stairs. She ignored the formality of the moment and pulled me into a fierce hug. She whispered in my ear that this was the absolute peak of justice and undoubtedly the greatest revenge in the history of the company. I hugged her back, finally letting a small, genuine smile touch my lips. The storm was over, the debris was being cleared, and the air had never felt cleaner. It has been 7 days since the gala, and the silence in my penthouse is no longer heavy. It feels expansive. For the first time in years, I can hear my own thoughts without the background noise of Julian's constant demands and gaslighting. The apartment is finally mine, not just on paper, but in spirit. I spent the morning walking through the rooms, reclaiming the space that had felt like a battlefield for so long. Yesterday, the phone in the hallway rang. The caller ID displayed the number for the county detention center. It was Julian, using his one allocated phone call to beg for bail money. I did not pick up. Instead, I let the call go to voicemail, recorded his desperate, sobbing plea, and forwarded the audio file directly to my divorce attorney. I blocked the number immediately after. There is no conversation left to be had. He is a ghost from a past life, and ghosts do not get to make phone calls. Sierra, or Brenda as she is now known in the press, is facing a reality far grimmer than a bad hair day. It turns out she was a fugitive wanted in 2 other states for similar confidence schemes. With the new charges of grand larceny and fraud added to her record, the district attorney is pushing for a sentence of 10 years. The internet, which she once used to curate her fake life, has turned on her completely, dissecting her lies with ruthless efficiency. She wanted fame, and she got it, just not the kind that comes with brand deals. But the prison sentence is the least of Julian's worries. In my forensic audit of our finances, I discovered that he had borrowed a significant sum of money from unauthorized underground lenders to fund Sierra's lifestyle. Those are not the kind of creditors who send polite overdue notices. They are the kind who have reach even inside the prison walls. Julian is now locked in a cage with the very people he owes money to, and I suspect his time behind bars will be very uncomfortable. While clearing out his home office, I found the final piece of the puzzle tucked inside a false bottom of his desk drawer. It was a drafted contract, dated 2 months ago. He had been planning to trick me into signing a transfer of assets, disguising it as a tax-saving measure. He intended to steal the penthouse, my savings, and my stocks before discarding me. I held the paper in my hand, feeling the texture of his betrayal one last time. Then, I walked over to the fireplace. I lit a match and watched the flames curl around the edges of the document. I stood there until it was nothing but gray ash, watching the last remnant of my marriage disappear up the chimney. The board of Nebula Horizon did not just thank me for saving the company, they rewarded me. This morning, I was officially appointed as the executive vice president. They realized that the person who could bring down a corrupt CEO with a light show and a soundboard was exactly the kind of person they needed in charge. My first act of business was to order a complete renovation of my office, removing every trace of the man who used to sit there. I have also changed the locks on the penthouse and ordered new furniture. The leather sofa Julian loved is gone, replaced by velvet in a shade of deep blue that he would have hated. I have scrubbed his scent, his style, and his negative energy from every square inch of my life. Now, I stand on the balcony, looking out over the city lights of New York. The wind is cool against my skin. I realize now that the best revenge was never about hurting them directly. It was about stepping back and letting their own greed and arrogance be the gravity that pulled them down. I did not have to push them. I just had to turn on the lights so the world could see them falling. I smile, turn off my phone, and pour myself a glass of vintage red wine. I take a sip, tasting the rich, complex notes of victory. Below me, the city hums with life, a symphony of chaos and beauty. But up here, it is quiet. The performance is over, the critics have gone home, and for the first time in my life, the only voice I have to listen to is my own. The real show is just beginning. Thank you so much for listening to my story, and please comment down below where you are listening from so we can share our thoughts together. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel Lily Revenge Stories, like the video, and smash that like button so this story can be heard by even more people.